everyone, welcome to this very first video in the IB Economics syllabus, and we begin with the chapter 1.1, What is Economics? And this is video 1, and there's going to be 4 videos in this chapter. So just taking a quick look at the IB Economics syllabus. There's another video on my channel where I talk through the course as a whole, but just very briefly, we're going to now start Unit 1, Introduction to Economics. There's 2 chapters. There's 10 hours for SL and 10 hours for HL, so it's the same content for both. And then after this, we get into micro and macro, which is, and Unit 4 of the global economy, which is, you can see by the hours, is obviously been the main thrust of the course. I'm going to talk about micro and macro in a minute. And then you've got the IA, and you can see that over the 2 years, SL's 150 hours and HL's 240 hours. But there's another video where I go through this in a lot more detail. So Unit 1, Introduction to Economics, is 2 chapters. What is economics and how do economists approach the world? This is kind of like a soft introduction to economics. It's got lots of little things that we're going to go through. But I would say the course mainly starts when we get to Unit 2, Micro. That's kind of when I think it really begins. So this is like a soft introduction to the course. Within 1.1, it's actually a very, very long syllabus. If you look in the IB guide, it's 2 pages, more than 2 pages, and I can't actually fit all of it onto one slide. So this ... means there's actually sub-objectives in there. And so I'm going to do 4 videos, 1 for each of these, and within each video I'll actually show you the learning objective for each one. So let's get going. The first, so you can see here, the first one is economics as a social science. So on this slide, I've actually put in those 3 learning objectives, and I'll do that for each of the 4 videos. So we're going to do economics as a social science. There's 3 things. This should be fairly quick. There isn't too much here. So this is, let's get going. So the social nature of economics, what is and how do we define economics? I think economics is a very problematic subject to define. When students say, what is economics? What's the definition? I think it's very difficult to define it, because if you look in textbooks and Wikipedia, for example, this is a Wikipedia. Economics is a behavioral science that studies the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. I think if you tell that to someone who's never studied economics, they're like, what? What's that all about? And then if we go to Investopedia, which is a really good source, as we'll talk about another time, economics is a social science that focuses on the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. The study of economics is primarily concerned with the analysing choices and individual. So I'm not going to read slides every time I do it, but you can see that I think defining economics is quite problematic. And I think one thing I tell people is go and study it. After you've studied it for a while, you'll kind of know what it's about. But in red, I've kind of put the key things. It's a social science, which I'll define in a minute. We're talking about production, so businesses produce things, businesses and other entities distribute things, and consumers and other businesses consume goods and services. And we'll define those later, but goods and services are things that we can buy, basically. It's concerned with analysing choice and allocating limited resources. So next video, we'll look at what does allocating limited resources mean. And it's all about making the best choice. So I think the way I like to define it is how do we make the best choice about allocating limited or scarce resources? And if you're not sure what that means, we're going to go through that in the next video. The actual learning objective here is social science. So economics, the social nature of economics. Economics is a social science, which means it's a scientific study of humans as individuals and in groups, and how humans make decisions and then interact with each other. So in science, when you do physics, chemistry, etc., you study the world. In economics, we study humans in the world and how they interact with each other. Economics is scientific in the sense that there are experiments, but there are problems with that, which we'll get into in a later video. So, for example, one thing we'll look at is how do people respond to changes in the price of a product. So again, this is how do humans react as individuals and groups when something changes. Other social sciences you might do are psychology, sociology, political science, anthropology, etc., etc. All right, so the next thing is microeconomics and macroeconomics. And you can see that the actual course is structured around microeconomics and macroeconomics. It's actually a term I very rarely say because most people just say micro and macro. So if you've heard these terms before, they're just parts of economics. They're parts of economics where you study different things within the subject. So micro studies individual markets and individual economic agents. Again, we'll define these terms later, such as consumers and producers. So if I give you some examples, I think it'll make a bit more sense. So for example, we look at individual markets. So if we look at just the market for smartphones, we look at Apple, Samsung in those markets. How do people react to changes in prices? How do businesses change prices, etc., etc.? That would be a micro topic. The currency market of euros to dollars. So if you go to the currency shop or wherever and you change currency, then that's an individual market. And the labour market in Germany. So labour market is companies want workers and people want to supply their own work. So that would be a micro topic. The opposite is macroeconomics, which we shorten to macro. And this studies the economy as a whole. So if we look at the whole German economy, that would be a macro topic. And things we might look in a macro are things like unemployment. Unemployment is when people don't have jobs, inflation, real GDP, etc., etc. But obviously, when we get to units 2 and 3, we're going to look at those in a lot more detail. Final thing is the 9 central concepts of the course. These come up again and again. These come up specifically in the IA where you have to use one of these concepts. And I'm going to very, very briefly define these terms because we're going to come across them again. So scarcity is when we have a limited availability of something. If you look in textbooks, you're going to get formal definitions which have very long. What I've tried to do here is just define them very, very briefly because in economics they have a specific meaning. So scarcity is the limited availability of something. And like I said earlier, this is kind of what economics is about. Resources are limited, so we need to make choices about how we allocate resources. So economics is the study of decision making in the face of scarcity. And I just talked about choice as well, so I won't talk about that again. Efficiency is trying to do something as well as possible. Specifically, if we've got a limited availability of something and we have to make choices, how do we make the best decisions? And that's something specifically we'll do in this subject. Equity is related to fairness. So one thing we'll see is it's almost impossible to be fair to everybody. Whenever a government or someone makes a decision, it's probably going to benefit someone and someone else is going to lose out. So how do we judge that issue of fairness? Economic well-being is quality of life within an economy. So having lots of money, having a job, etc., etc. Sustainability, I actually put the formal definition here. The ability of the present generation to satisfy their needs without sacrificing the needs of future generations. This is sustainability in an economic context. So an example might be if we use all of the oil, it means in the future people don't have oil. So that's not a sustainable decision. So we'll be looking at that. Change is moving from one state to another. Terrible definition, but change is basically when something changes. I think we can get what that means. Interdependent means that things and people are connected. An example using the smartphone market is when consumers buy something, that affects the company that you buy it from. So pretty much everything within econ is going to be interdependent. One decision is going to affect someone else. And then intervention is when governments get involved in markets. And when we study micro and macro, we'll go into that in a lot more detail. Okay, that is the first video done within 1.1 What is Economics? I'll see you next time for the problem of choice.